Hi, I'm Uni Jang, your host. For centuries, knitters and crocheters have gathered together to practice their craft. Fiber crafts have a way of bringing people together, and today on Knitting Daily, we'll look at some popular group projects. We get started with techniques for modular knitting, knitting that involves making small pieces of knitted fabric, like Afghan squares, which are then joined together. These types of projects are especially popular with groups making blankets and throws for charity. Then we meet Shay and Debbie Stoller on location to discuss the phenomenon of the knit-along and how the knitting hobby has taken off among 20 and 30-something women. Next, on our Crochet Corner, Kristen offers a primer on basic finishing techniques for crochet projects. Then in today's how-to lesson, Barry Klein and Laura Bryant join Shay for a tutorial on how to adapt a pattern written for one gauge to another gauge. It's a lot easier than you might think. And finally, I'll finish up with 3 quick tips on weaving in 2 short ends. So let's begin with modular knitting. If you take a look at this blanket to my right here, you can see that a blanket is a really fun project for a big group of people. The individual squares are very portable, they give you a great sense of accomplishment as you see them building up, and it is possible to knit them together as you are knitting to eliminate seaming at the end. But it can also be fun to have a group knit all the individual squares and then throw a great big finishing party. So come on in with me and we'll take a look at some of the common things that might happen when you have a group of people working on one project together. Of course, every knitter is different. Every knitter has a slightly different gauge, a slightly different way of holding the yarn. Maybe they have a slightly different way of binding off. Maybe they finish them differently. And if you have a number of different people working on one project, you're necessarily going to get a little bit of variance in the sizes and shapes of the finished pieces. And in something like a blanket, in something like a modular blanket, you really want to have those finished pieces be as identical as possible to make your finishing as smooth as it could be. So I'm going to show you here. This is sort of our 6-inch square, our ideal 6-inch square that we want. But we might get pieces that are, you know, an inch sort of short on one end, or we might get pieces that are an inch short all around. So what can you do to even them up? Well, one thing that you could do is try to even it out in blocking. You know, and especially with natural fiber yarns like wool, that can really make a big difference. The second thing that you could do is actually just go ahead and add on some knitting. So for example, on this green square, I'm going to just pick up some stitches along this edge and just knit another inch or so. And you can do it in a color that matches, but I think that it can add a little bit of sort of organic creativity to your blanket to use another contrast color here. And so just for a quick refresher in picking up stitches, I'm just going to show you here that all you want to do is look for your bind off loops. Insert your needle in through those 2 loops, wrap your yarn, and then pull it through. And you can do that for every single bind off stitch. And then you would just go ahead and pick up all along this edge, and then you could knit in whatever fancy stitch you wanted, or you could match the pattern, or you could keep it very subtle with just a plain stockinette stitch or a garter stitch. So that's pretty straightforward. If you have a piece that's short on both sides, I'll compare this pink square to the yellow square. If you have a piece that's short on both sides, you have a choice. You can either pick up stitches along this edge and this edge, so going in this direction to this direction, and then work back and forth, mitering this corner out. Or you could pick up stitches all the way around and then miter all 4 corners and knit in the round. And in order to do that, you could use either double pointed needles, and you would do this exactly the same way. You would just pick up in the bind off loops with your contrast color, and so on. And you would just pick up on all 4 sides, and then you would increase at each corner to make sure that you were maintaining a square shape. So once all your pieces are the same size, how do you put them together? Well, there are a couple of different ways, and obviously, you know, the mattress stitch is one of the first things that we learn as knitters who are learning about how to finish our garments. And in order to do that, you want to kind of match up the 2 bottom corners of your knitting, and then you're going to stay within this kind of 1 stitch edge. You're going to pick up 2 horizontal bars from one piece, pull the yarn through, and then pick up 2 corresponding horizontal bars. Hopefully you can see that there, and pull the yarn through. And you would keep doing this all the way up. And of course I'm using a contrasting color so that you can see this really clearly, but you may want to do this in a color or a neutral color that disappears into your fabric. But for the most part, once you finish the seam and you put a little bit of tension on the yarn, the seam pretty much disappears. The other thing that you can do is use kind of a decorative seam. And here you would want to use a contrasting color just specifically because it's pretty. And I'm going to show you how to do a really simple, just baseball stitch seam, which is exactly the kind of stitch that you see on a baseball. So I'm going to work about 1 stitch in from the edge, or 2 stitches, counting that selvage stitch. I'm going to come up at a point. Oops. And you can always leave your ends loose on your seaming yarn and then go back and weave them all in together later. I'm going to turn my work 90 degrees here. And I've come up out of my left-hand piece, or my bottom piece. Now I'm going to go underneath my top piece and come up 1 stitch from the edge. And you can see that half that stitch is visible. Now I've come up out of my top piece. I'm going to go under my bottom piece and come up again 1 stitch from the edge. And when you seam this way, you'll just repeat this over and over again. When you seam this way, you're actually butting those 2 edges up against each other. You're not losing anything to the seam. There's no seam allowance, in other words. So this can be a really fun decorative stitch to use for your blankets. And when you're seaming a project like this, I always recommend taking a cue from quilting and sewing together in long strips first and then sewing the strips together rather than having a million little ends to weave in.